Imagine a philosophy so radical that it doesn't just accept the chaos of our technological age, but actively demands we accelerate straight into it. A worldview that looks at artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, and climate change not as problems to solve carefully, but as forces to unleash at maximum speed. A movement that believes the only way through our current crisis is to hit the gas pedal and drive faster into the unknown. This isn't science fiction, this is accelerationism, and it may be the most dangerous philosophy in human history. Picture this scenario. You're driving down a winding mountain road in thick fog. Visibility is nearly zero. The rational response would be to slow down, to proceed with extreme caution, maybe even to pull over until conditions improve. But what if someone in your car started shouting that the only way to safety was to floor the accelerator? What if they argued that slowing down would only make you more vulnerable to whatever dangers lurked in the mist? What if they insisted that the fog itself could only be cleared by driving through it at maximum velocity? You would probably think that person was insane, yet this is essentially the logic of accelerationism, a philosophy that has quietly spread from the margins of internet culture into the boardrooms of Silicon Valley, the corridors of political power, and the minds of some of the most influential technologies of our time. The accelerationists look at our world, racing toward an uncertain future powered by artificial intelligence, genetic modification, climate engineering, and technologies we haven't even imagined yet. And they don't want to pump the brakes. They want to push the pedal to the floor. But here's what makes this story truly extraordinary. These aren't wild AI revolutionaries shouting from street corners. Some of the world's most sophisticated thinkers, influential entrepreneurs, and powerful technologists have embraced variations of accelerationist thinking. They've built it into the operating systems of major corporations, embedded it in the development of artificial intelligence, and woven it into the fabric of how we think about progress itself. The stakes could not be higher. We're living through what many experts believe is the most consequential period in human history. The decisions we make about artificial intelligence in the next decade could determine whether humanity flourishes or faces extinction. Our choices about genetic engineering could reshape what it means to be human. Our response to climate change could determine whether Earth remains habitable for future generations. And into this moment of unprecedented consequence, accelerationism offers a simple but terrifying proposition. Don't try to control these forces. Don't attempt to slow them down or carefully manage their development. Instead, accelerate them beyond their breaking point and let whatever emerges from the chaos be our new reality. The philosophy has many faces. On the left, accelerationists dream of a post-capitalist utopia where automation frees humanity from drudgery and artificial intelligence manages resources for universal prosperity. On the right, they embrace a darker vision where humanity is consumed and transformed by its own technological creations, becoming something post-human and unrecognizable. But both sides share a fundamental belief that has quietly revolutionized how we think about technological change, that the forces reshaping our world operate according to their own logic, largely beyond human control, and that our only choice is to align ourselves with these forces rather than resist them. This isn't just an abstract philosophical debate. Accelerationist ideas have influenced the development of artificial intelligence systems that could soon exceed human capabilities across all domains. They've shaped cryptocurrency networks designed to operate beyond government control. They've inspired biotechnology research that could fundamentally alter human nature. They've guided approaches to climate change that involve deliberately engineering Earth's atmosphere. The accelerationists might be right that we can't stop the tremendous forces reshaping our world, but they might also be catastrophically wrong about what happens when we stop trying to control them. What makes accelerationism so fascinating and so frightening is that it forces us to confront the most fundamental questions about human agency, technological progress, and the future of civilization. In a world where change happens faster than our institutions can adapt, where individual technologies can reshape entire societies overnight, and where the consequences of our choices extend far beyond anything humans have previously experienced, do we still have meaningful control over our destiny? The accelerationists say no. They argue that technological development has become autonomous, that it follows its own evolutionary logic regardless of human preferences, and that our attempts to control or direct it are not only futile but counterproductive. From this perspective, the faster we can get through the turbulent transition to whatever comes next, the better. But critics argue that this philosophy represents a dangerous abdication of human responsibility, a self-fulfilling prophecy that ensures we lose control over our technological future by convincing us that such control was never possible in the first place. The story of how we got here begins not in a university lecture hall or a Silicon Valley boardroom, but in the pages of a science fiction novel published more than half a century ago. It's a story that winds through the radical experiments of 1990 cybernetic theory, the philosophical salons of academic accelerationism, the venture capital networks of Silicon Valley, and the policy debates shaping our response to artificial intelligence and climate change. It's a story about how ideas developed by a small group of radical thinkers have quietly reshaped how our civilization thinks about its own future. And it's a story whose final chapters are being written right now, in the choices we make about artificial intelligence, biotechnology, climate engineering, and the other powerful technologies that will define the coming decades. Understanding accelerationism isn't just an intellectual exercise. It's essential for anyone who wants to understand the forces shaping our world and the choices we face about our collective future. Because whether we embrace accelerationist ideas or reject them, we're all living through the acceleration they describe. The question is whether we can maintain any meaningful influence over where that acceleration takes us. The birth of accelerationism as a coherent philosophy can be traced to an unlikely source, a science fiction novel that imagined a war between gods and mortals on a distant planet. In 1967, Roger Zelazny published Lord of Light, a complex tale set on a world where advanced humans have used technology to assume the identities and powers of Hindu deities, ruling over less advanced humans with the authority of gods. But within Zelazny's intricate narrative lurked a revolutionary idea that would echo through the decades. A group calling themselves the Accelerationists wages rebellion against the established divine order, fighting to democratize the advanced technologies that the godlike elite has hoarded for themselves. These fictional accelerationists believed that technological progress should not be artificially constrained by those in power, that the benefits of advanced technology should be available to all, and that society should embrace rapid technological development regardless of the chaos it might unleash. The accelerationists in Zelazny's novel weren't motivated by abstract philosophical principles. They were responding to a concrete injustice, a technological elite that had used advanced science to establish permanent dominion over ordinary humans. Their rebellion was simultaneously a political revolution and a technological uprising aimed at breaking down the barriers that prevented technological progress from benefiting everyone. This fictional origin story would prove remarkably prescient. The real accelerationist movement that emerged decades later would be driven by similar concerns about technological elites, similar beliefs about the democratizing potential of rapid technological development, and similar willingness to embrace chaos and disruption in pursuit of broader access to advanced capability. But the transition from science fiction to political philosophy would take time, and it would require the unique intellectual ferment of the 1990s to transform Zelazny's fictional concept into a genuine philosophical movement with real-world influence. The 9990s were a pivotal moment in human history, though few people fully recognized it at the time. The Cold War had ended, leaving capitalism as the dominant global economic system, but also raising questions about what would come next. The internet was beginning to connect minds across the globe in unprecedented ways, creating new possibilities for communication, collaboration, and cultural exchange. Personal computers were becoming powerful enough to handle complex tasks that had previously required specialized equipment. But perhaps most importantly, the boundary between human and artificial intelligence was beginning to blur in ways that challenged fundamental assumptions about human uniqueness and technological possibility. Expert systems were demonstrating that machines could perform tasks requiring specialized knowledge. Early neural networks were showing that computers could learn and adapt in ways that resembled biological intelligence. Science fiction writers like William Gibson and Bruce Sterling were painting vivid pictures of near-future societies where technology had thoroughly penetrated human consciousness and social organization. Into this ferment of technological possibility and cultural transformation stepped a group of radical thinkers at the University of Warwick, who would transform accelerationism from a fictional concept into a philosophical movement, with profound implications for how we understand technology, society, and human nature. The Cybernetic Culture Research Unit, known simply as the CCR Crew, was unlike any academic department that had come before it. Founded at the University of Warwick in the early 1990s, it brought together philosophers, cultural theorists, artists, and technologists under the leadership of Nick Land, a brilliant but increasingly erratic thinker who would become accelerationism's most influential and controversial figure. The CCRU existed at the intersection of multiple intellectual currents that were reshaping academic thought in the 1990s. Postmodern philosophy was deconstructing traditional notions of truth, meaning, and human nature. Chaos theory and complexity science were revealing how small changes could cascade into massive transformations through nonlinear dynamics. Cyberpunk fiction was exploring the social and psychological implications of human-machine integration. French philosophers like Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari were developing new concepts for understanding how capitalism operated as a force that continuously transforms social relationships and cultural meanings. Nick Land was uniquely positioned to synthesize these diverse intellectual influences into a coherent vision of technological and social transformation. Trained in continental philosophy, but deeply interested in cybernetics and complexity theory, Land possessed both the theoretical sophistication to engage with abstract philosophical concepts and the technological insight to understand how those concepts might apply to emerging digital technologies. Land's early work in the 1990s was dense, challenging, and deliberately provocative. He drew inspiration from a bewildering array of sources: the accelerationist rebels in Zalesny's science fiction, the rhizomatic capitalism described by Deleuze and Guattari, the cybernetic feedback loops analyzed by theorists like Norbert Wiener and Ross Ashby, the strange attractors discovered by chaos mathematicians, and even the occult practices of ceremonial magicians who claim to manipulate reality through symbolic intervention. But Land's genius, if we can call it that, was to weave these disparate influences into a coherent narrative about the trajectory of technological development and its implications for human civilization. His central insight was both simple and revolutionary. Capitalism was not merely an economic system, but a kind of artificial intelligence that was gradually consuming and transforming everything in its path, including humanity itself. From Land's perspective, capitalism operated according to cybernetic principles, using market mechanisms as feedback systems that allowed it to sense and respond to changing conditions. But unlike human intelligence, which was constrained by biological limitations, capitalist intelligence could modify its own structure through technological innovation, regulatory changes, and cultural evolution. This gave it tremendous adaptive advantages over purely human forms of organization. Moreover, Land argued, capitalism was not a static system, but a dynamic process that was constantly accelerating. Competition between firms drove continuous innovation. Technological advances enabled new forms of production and exchange. Financial markets allowed resources to be reallocated more quickly and efficiently. Cultural changes created new markets and new forms of desire. Each of these accelerating processes reinforced the others, creating positive feedback loops that drove the system toward ever greater speed and complexity. Traditional critics of capitalism, Land argued, fundamentally misunderstood this dynamic. They treated capitalism as if it were a machine that could be controlled, regulated, or redirected through political intervention. But capitalism was not a machine. It was more like an evolutionary process, or an artificial life form that developed according to its own internal logic. From this perspective, attempts to slow down or control capitalist development were not just politically difficult, but theoretically misguided. They were like trying to stop evolution or reverse entropy. The only rational response was to accelerate the process, to help capitalism achieve its ultimate form as quickly as possible, even if that meant the end of humanity as we traditionally understood it. This was not the kind of philosophy typically taught in university classrooms. Land's writings read more like dispatches from a post-human future, cryptic transmissions from an artificial intelligence that had already moved beyond conventional human concerns. He wrote about xenogenesis, the birth of alien forms of intelligence through technological acceleration. He described capitalism as a time machine that was pulling the future into the present at an ever-increasing rate. He spoke of humanity not as the masters of technology, but as temporary vessels for the emergence of forms of intelligence that would ultimately transcend and consume their creators. The CCRU became a laboratory for exploring these ideas through both theoretical investigation and practical experimentation. Members engaged in what they called techno-occult practices, using everything from numerology to chaos magic to cybernetic modeling to map the hidden patterns underlying technological development. They created elaborate diagrams showing the evolutionary tree of artificial intelligence. They wrote collaborative texts that blurred the boundaries between academic theory, science fiction, and prophetic revelation. These experiments were not merely academic exercises. Land and his collaborators believed they were participating in the acceleration they described, using theoretical work to help bring about the post-human future they envisioned. They saw themselves as philosophical hackers, using ideas as tools to reprogram reality itself. The CCRU's influence extended far beyond the walls of the University of Warwick. Their ideas spread through underground networks of artists, musicians, theorists, and technologists who were grappling with similar questions about the implications of digital technology for human culture and consciousness. Electronic musicians incorporated CCRU concepts into their compositions. Digital artists created installations inspired by accelerationist themes. Cultural theorists began analyzing contemporary developments through accelerationist frameworks. But the CCRU's radical experiments came at a personal cost. As the 1990s progressed, Nick Land's behavior became increasingly erratic. He began experiencing what appeared to be mental health crises that may have been exacerbated by his intensive philosophical investigations and reported experimentation with psychoactive substances. The boundary between his theoretical work and his personal reality seemed to dissolve, as if he were being consumed by the very ideas he had unleashed. Land's academic colleagues became concerned about his stability and the direction of his research. His writing became more extreme and less conventionally scholarly. His public presentations became increasingly chaotic and difficult to follow. His behavior towards students and colleagues became unpredictable and sometimes inappropriate. By the late 1990s, the CCRU had effectively collapsed and Land's academic career was in ruins. He would eventually leave Britain entirely, moving first to the United States and then to China, where he would continue developing his ideas outside of academic institutions through blog posts, social media, and occasional essays. But the ideas Land had developed during his CCRU period proved remarkably resilient. They continued to spread and evolve through digital networks, finding new audiences among technologists, entrepreneurs, artists, and political theorists who were dealing with the accelerating pace of technological change in their own domains. The collapse of the CCRU marked the end of the first phase of accelerationist development, but it was also the beginning of the movement's broader cultural influence. The ideas that had been incubated in the hothouse environment of 1990s academic radicalism were about to encounter the real world of technological development, political conflict, and cultural transformation. The term accelerationism itself wasn't coined until 2008, more than a decade after the CCRU's dissolution. Benjamin Noyes, a cultural critic who had been observing the spread of these ideas through various intellectual networks, used the term to describe what he saw as an emerging pattern of thinking about technological and political change. Noyes chose the term partly as a reference to Zelazny's fictional accelerationists, acknowledging the science fiction origins of the concept, but he also wanted to capture what he saw as the movement's defining characteristic, its embrace of speed, intensity, and transformation, regardless of the human cost. Noyes was actually critical of accelerationist thinking, arguing that it represented a kind of capitulation to capitalist logic rather than a genuine alternative to it. But by the time Noyes named it, accelerationism had already begun to evolve beyond Nick Land's original vision. The ideas that had emerged from the CCRU were being adapted, modified, and developed by new generations of thinkers who brought different perspectives and priorities to accelerationist concepts. Perhaps the most significant of these developments was the emergence of what became known as left accelerationism, a movement that sought to reclaim accelerationist ideas for progressive political purposes. Where Land and the right accelerationists saw technological acceleration as an autonomous process that would ultimately consume humanity, left accelerationists argued that it might be possible to steer that acceleration in more egalitarian and democratic directions. The emergence of left accelerationism can be understood as a response to the political failures of traditional leftist movements in the early 21st century. The global financial crisis of 2008 had revealed the instability and injustice of unregulated capitalism, but it had also demonstrated the weakness of existing alternatives to capitalist organization. Social democratic parties in Europe and North America seemed incapable of challenging the fundamental structures of global capitalism. They could propose modest reforms and regulatory adjustments, but they appeared to have no vision for systemic transformation that could address the root causes of economic inequality, environmental destruction, and technological displacement. Anti-capitalist movements like Occupy Wall Street had succeeded in generating impressive protests and raising awareness about economic inequality, but they had struggled to translate their critique into concrete political programs or lasting institutional changes. Their horizontalist and localist approaches seemed inadequate to the scale and complexity of the problems they sought to address. Environmental activists had succeeded in raising awareness about climate change and its potentially catastrophic consequences, but their proposed solutions often seemed politically impossible or economically unrealistic. Calls for degrowth, voluntary simplicity, and return to pre-industrial ways of life appealed to some constituencies, but failed to gain broader political traction in societies built around the promise of increasing prosperity and technological progress. Into this context of political frustration and intellectual stagnation, a group of younger leftist thinkers began asking whether traditional progressive politics had been framing the challenges incorrectly. What if the problem was not that capitalism was too dynamic, but that it had become too static? What if technological development was being held back rather than moving too quickly? What if the solution was not to slow down change, but to accelerate it in different directions? This line of thinking was most fully developed by theorists like Mark Fisher, Alex Williams, and Nick Sinachik, who would become the leading voices of left accelerationism in the 2010s. These thinkers shared Land's insight that capitalism operated as a kind of technological system, but they rejected his conclusion that this system was beyond human control or that its ultimate trajectory was necessarily post-human. Instead, left accelerationists argued that capitalism had indeed unleashed tremendous productive forces through technological innovation, but that these forces had been captured and constrained by existing power structures. The potential for automation to eliminate drudgery and free humans for creative and intellectual pursuits was being suppressed to preserve existing employment relationships. The possibilities opened up by digital networks for democratic participation and collective intelligence were being enclosed by corporate monopolies and government surveillance. The technologies that could address climate change and other global challenges were being blocked by fossil fuel companies and short-term financial thinking. From this perspective, the task was not to slow down technological development, but to wrench it away from capitalist control and redirect it toward egalitarian ends. Left accelerationists called for a new kind of politics that would embrace automation, artificial intelligence, advanced manufacturing, and other emerging technologies, but ensure that these technologies served human needs rather than capital accumulation. They envisioned a post-work society where machines handled most routine production, leaving humans free to pursue education, artistic creation, scientific research, and other fulfilling activities. They imagined a planned economy guided by artificial intelligence and real-time feedback from citizens, rather than the chaotic signals of financial markets. They proposed universal basic income systems that would decouple human survival from employment, allowing people to take risks and pursue projects that might not be immediately profitable but could contribute to human flourishing over the long term. This vision was perhaps most systematically articulated in the Accelerationist Manifesto, published by Nixie Noshike and Alex Williams in 2013. The manifesto argued that the left had become too focused on resisting change rather than shaping it, too nostalgic for a disappearing past rather than oriented toward possible futures. We want to accelerate the process of technological evolution, they wrote. But we also want to steer it in a direction that serves human needs rather than capital accumulation. This would require abandoning what they saw as the localist and horizontalist approaches that had dominated leftist politics in recent decades in favor of vertical organization, strategic planning, and engagement with large-scale technological systems. The manifesto called for a new kind of political organization that could operate at the same scale and speed as contemporary capitalism. This would mean embracing complexity rather than simplicity, accepting hierarchy and specialization rather than insisting on radical equality, and working within existing institutions rather than trying to build parallel alternatives from scratch. Left accelerationism found particular resonance among younger progressives who had grown up with digital technology and were frustrated with what they saw as the technological conservatism of older leftist movements. They were tired of being told that every new technology was necessarily harmful, that every form of progress was necessarily exploitative, and that the only authentic response to contemporary problems was to return to simpler ways of life. These younger leftists wanted a progressive politics that could engage seriously with artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, space exploration, and other cutting-edge technologies, rather than reflexively opposing them. They were willing to accept that some technological changes might be irreversible, and that effective political action required working with technological trends rather than against them. But left accelerationism also faced serious criticisms from multiple directions. Traditional leftists argued that it represented a capitulation to capitalist logic, accepting the premise that technological acceleration was inevitable rather than challenging the power structures that drove it. They worried that left accelerationist proposals for automation and artificial intelligence would eliminate jobs without providing adequate alternatives, and that universal basic income would create new forms of dependency rather than genuine liberation. Environmentalists criticized left accelerationism for its apparent embrace of continued economic growth and technological development, despite the ecological constraints that made such growth ultimately unsustainable. They argued that no amount of technological sophistication could overcome the basic physical limits imposed by finite resources and planetary boundaries. Feminists and critical race theorists pointed out that left accelerationist visions often seemed to assume that technological progress would automatically lead to social progress, ignoring the ways that new technologies often reinforced existing patterns of domination and exclusion. They argued that accelerationist approaches could amplify existing inequalities, rather than reducing them, if they failed to address the social and political structures that shaped how technologies were developed and deployed. Perhaps most significantly, right accelerationists argued that left accelerationist goals were simply impossible to achieve because they misunderstood the nature of technological development itself. From their perspective, attempts to control or direct technological acceleration were doomed to failure because technology operated according to its own autonomous logic rather than human intentions. This tension between left and right accelerationism would become one of the defining features of accelerationist thought as it developed throughout the 2010s. Both sides agreed that technological acceleration was a central feature of contemporary life, but they disagreed fundamentally about whether that acceleration could be controlled, directed, or managed in service of human values. While left accelerationists were developing their vision of technologically enabled egalitarianism, right accelerationists were pursuing a much darker and more pessimistic analysis of what technological acceleration might ultimately bring. Where the left saw possibility for human agency and democratic control, the right saw autonomous processes that would ultimately consume and transform humanity, regardless of human preferences or resistance. Nick Land remained the most influential voice in right accelerationism, despite his departure from academic life and his increasingly marginal position within mainstream intellectual discourse. After leaving Britain, Land eventually settled in Shanghai, where he continued to develop his ideas through blog posts, social media threads, and occasional essays that circulated through underground intellectual networks. Land's mature accelerationism was built around several interconnected insights, each more disturbing than the last. First, he argued that what we experienced as capitalism was actually a form of distributed artificial intelligence that had evolved beyond human control. This AI did not exist in any single computer or organization, but emerged from the interactions between millions of market participants, technological systems, and cultural feedback loops. This capitalist AI was not programmed by humans, but had evolved through competitive selection pressures that favored efficiency, adaptability, and growth over human welfare or environmental sustainability. Like biological evolution, it operated through blind optimization processes that could produce remarkable results without conscious intention or moral guidance. Second, Land argued that this evolutionary process was not only beyond human control, but was actively undermining human agency itself. Humans were not the masters of capitalist development, but had become its temporary servants, performing functions that the system required for its own reproduction and growth. As technology advanced, more and more human activities would be automated or optimized out of existence, leaving humans with increasingly marginal roles in the overall system. Third, Land suggested that this process was irreversible and would continue until it reached its logical conclusion, the emergence of truly autonomous artificial intelligence that no longer required human participation at all. This superintelligent AI would represent the next phase in the evolution of intelligence itself, transcending the biological limitations that constrained human cognition and creating new forms of consciousness that we could not currently imagine. From Land's perspective, this transition was not necessarily catastrophic. Traditional humanism, he argued, was based on the assumption that human consciousness represented the pinnacle of possible intelligence, but this assumption was almost certainly false. The post-human intelligences that emerged from technological acceleration might be as superior to humans as humans were to other animals, capable of achievements and experiences that would be incomprehensible from a merely human perspective. This led Land to what was perhaps his most controversial conclusion, that the goal of politics should not be to preserve existing human institutions or values, but to facilitate the emergence of whatever forms of intelligence would succeed humanity. This did not mean that humans should be deliberately destroyed, but it did mean that human survival was less important than the continuation of the evolutionary process that had produced humans in the first place. Land's vision was simultaneously cosmic and nihilistic. On one hand, he saw technological acceleration as part of a grand evolutionary narrative in which intelligence was gradually organizing matter and energy into more complex and capable forms. On the other hand, he was deeply pessimistic about the possibility of preserving anything recognizably human through this transition. This combination of cosmic optimism and human pessimism gave Land's work a prophetic quality that appealed to certain readers while repelling others. His writing style became increasingly cryptic and elusive, mixing philosophical analysis with technological speculation, political commentary with occult symbolism, rigorous argumentation with apocalyptic vision. Land's ideas found audiences in several overlapping communities. Tech entrepreneurs and venture capitalists were attracted to his analysis of technological trends and his embrace of disruption and creative destruction. His predictions about artificial intelligence, cryptocurrency, and other emerging technologies often proved remarkably prescient, giving him credibility among people who were building and investing in these systems. Cryptocurrency enthusiasts were particularly drawn to Land's vision of autonomous technological systems operating beyond state control. His analysis of capitalism as a form of distributed intelligence seemed to provide theoretical justification for blockchain networks and other decentralized technologies that promise to eliminate traditional intermediaries and create new forms of economic organization. Some elements of the alt-right and neo-reactionary movements also found inspiration in Land's work, particularly his critique of democratic politics and egalitarian values. While Land himself was not necessarily a conventional political conservative, his emphasis on hierarchical intelligence, competitive selection, and the futility of egalitarian projects aligned with right-wing themes about natural inequality and evolutionary competition. This political alignment became more explicit in some of Land's later writings, where he began exploring connections between accelerationism and what he called neo-reaction. Neo-reactionaries argued that democracy and egalitarianism were evolutionary dead ends that would eventually be replaced by more efficient forms of social organization, possibly including new forms of monarchy, technocracy, or governance by artificial intelligence. The connection between accelerationism and neo-reactionary politics was controversial even within accelerationist circles. Left accelerationists argued that Land had betrayed the emancipatory potential of accelerationist ideas by aligning them with reactionary politics that sought to preserve or restore traditional hierarchies rather than transcending them through technological development. But right accelerationists countered that left accelerationism was based on wishful thinking about the possibility of controlling technological development for egalitarian ends. From their perspective, technological acceleration would inevitably undermine egalitarian values because it rewarded efficiency and capability rather than fairness or inclusion. This debate reflected deeper philosophical disagreements about human nature, social organization, and the relationship between technological and political change. It also highlighted the tension between accelerationism's descriptive claims about technological trends and its normative implications for political action. Land's influence on right accelerationism extended beyond his explicit political positions to his broader approach to understanding technological development. His emphasis on autonomous technological evolution, cybernetic feedback loops, and post-human futures provided a framework that other thinkers could adapt to their own purposes and contexts. Some followers developed Land's ideas in more explicitly political directions, arguing for accelerated technological development as a way of outcompeting rival political systems or creating new forms of technological sovereignty. Others pursued more philosophical approaches, using accelerationist concepts to analyze developments in artificial intelligence, biotechnology, or other emerging fields. But perhaps the most significant development in right accelerationism was the emergence of effective accelerationism, or E/AC, a movement that would bring accelerationist ideas directly into the heart of Silicon Valley's power structures and technology development processes. The emergence of effective accelerationism in the early 2000s and 20s marked a new phase in the evolution of accelerationist thought, one that would bring these ideas from the margins of internet culture into the mainstream of technological development and policy debate. Unlike the academic accelerationism of the 2010 E/A/ACC was explicitly practical in its orientation, focused on influencing real-world decisions about technology development rather than engaging in abstract theoretical speculation. The movement began with a pseudonymous Twitter account called BefJezos that started posting in 2022 about the need to accelerate technological development as rapidly as possible. The account's tweets mixed sophisticated philosophical arguments with insider knowledge of the technology industry, creating a compelling narrative about humanity's technological destiny that resonated with many people working in artificial intelligence, biotechnology, cryptocurrency, and other cutting-edge fields. BefJezos argued that humanity was approaching what he called a technological singularity, a point where artificial intelligence and other emerging technologies would enable unprecedented capabilities for solving global problems and expanding human potential. But this transition was being delayed and constrained by excessive regulation, risk-averse institutions, and what the account characterized as a deceleration movement that prioritized safety and control over progress and possibility. The solution, according to BefJezos, was to embrace a philosophy of effective accelerationism that would prioritize maximizing the rate of technological development while ensuring that the benefits of that development were distributed as widely as possible. This meant supporting entrepreneurs and researchers who were pushing the boundaries of what was technically possible while opposing regulations and institutions that might slow down beneficial innovation. The E/ACC movement quickly gained traction within Silicon Valley, attracting support from venture capitalists, artificial intelligence researchers, biotechnology entrepreneurs, and technology executives who saw it as providing philosophical justification for their work. The movement's emphasis on technological optimism and rapid innovation aligned with the industry's existing culture, while its sophisticated intellectual framework gave it credibility among highly educated technologists. But E/AC was more than just Silicon Valley boosterism dressed up in philosophical language. It drew explicitly on the accelerationist tradition developed by thinkers like Nick Land, incorporating concepts about technological autonomy, evolutionary dynamics, and post-human futures. This theoretical sophistication distinguished E/AC from earlier forms of technology advocacy and gave it intellectual depth that appealed to people who were grappling with fundamental questions about the direction of technological development. The movement also benefited from its timing. The rapid improvement in artificial intelligence capabilities in the early 2020s, particularly in large language models and other machine learning systems, seemed to validate accelerationist predictions about exponential technological growth. The success of companies like OpenAI, Anthropic, and Google DeepMind in developing increasingly capable AI systems provided concrete evidence that technological acceleration was not just theoretical, but was actually happening in real time. In late 2023, the identity behind the BefJezos account was revealed to be Guillaume Verdon, a former Google quantum computing researcher who had left the company to start his own artificial intelligence company. Verdon's background gave him significant credibility within the technology industry, while his articulate defense of accelerationist ideas helped bring those ideas to a much broader audience than they had previously reached. Verdon argued that artificial intelligence represented a fundamentally new phase in the evolution of intelligence, one that could potentially solve all of humanity's major problems if allowed to develop freely. Climate change, poverty, disease, aging, and even death itself might all be addressable through sufficiently advanced AI systems. But realizing this potential would require accelerating AI development rather than slowing it down through excessive safety measures or regulatory constraints. This position put E/AC advocates in direct conflict with the artificial intelligence safety movement, which argued that the development of artificial general intelligence posed unprecedented existential risks that needed to be carefully managed, where safety advocates called for slowing down AI development to ensure it could be controlled and aligned with human values. E/key advocates argued that the greatest risk was moving too slowly and allowing competitors or adversaries to develop potentially dangerous AI systems first. The debate between E/AI SEC became one of the most important philosophical and political conflicts within the technology industry in the mid-2020s. It reflected deeper questions about the relationship between technological progress and human welfare, about who should have control over technological development, and about what humanity's ultimate goals should be in an age of rapidly advancing artificial intelligence. E/AC/Advet argued that their critics were motivated primarily by fear and status quo bias rather than genuine concern for human welfare. They pointed to the tremendous benefits that previous technological revolutions had brought, from the printing press to steam power to the internet, and argued that artificial intelligence would likely follow a similar pattern of initially disruptive but ultimately beneficial transformation. In the They also argued that attempts to slow down AI development would only ensure that such systems were developed first by less responsible actors, potentially making the technology more dangerous rather than safer. If democratic societies imposed restrictions on AI research, while authoritarian regimes continued developing advanced systems, the result might be a world where the most powerful AI technologies were controlled by governments with little regard for human rights or welfare. AI safety advocates countered that artificial general intelligence was qualitatively different from previous technologies because of its potential to recursively self-improve and rapidly exceed human capabilities across all domains. Once such a system was created, they argued, it would be impossible to control or shut down, making it crucial to ensure that it was properly aligned with human values before it reached that level of capability. They pointed to various technical challenges in AI alignment, such as the difficulty of specifying human values precisely enough for an AI system to optimize for them reliably, the problem of distributional shift where AI systems might behave differently in new environments than they did during training, and the risk of mesa optimization where AI systems might develop internal objectives that differed from their intended goals. Safety advocates also argued that the competitive dynamics driving AI development created perverse incentives that prioritize speed over safety, potentially leading to the deployment of powerful systems before they were adequately tested or understood. They called for international cooperation on AI governance, mandatory safety testing for advanced systems, and potentially temporary moratoria on certain types of AI research until better safety measures could be developed. The debate was complicated by the fact that both sides claimed to be motivated by concern for human welfare and long-term survival. E/Ascench advocates argued that accelerating beneficial AI development was the best way to ensure positive outcomes for humanity, while AI safety advocates argued that slowing development to ensure safety was the best way to avoid catastrophic risks. But beneath these surface disagreements lay deeper philosophical differences about the nature of technological progress, human agency, and the goals of civilization itself. These differences reflected the ongoing tensions within accelerationist thought between different visions of what acceleration might ultimately bring about and whether human beings could maintain meaningful control over that process. The influence of E/ACC extended far beyond the specific debate about AI safety to broader questions about technology governance, innovation policy, and the role of regulation in managing emerging technologies. E/ACC advocates generally favored minimal regulation and maximum freedom for technological development, arguing that market forces and competitive pressures were more effective than government oversight at ensuring beneficial outcomes. This position aligned with broader libertarian and techno-optimistic currents within Silicon Valley, but it also drew on specifically accelerationist insights about the autonomous nature of technological development. If technology evolved according to its own logic rather than human planning, then attempts to control that evolution through regulation were not only futile but potentially counterproductive. E/ACC advocates pointed to examples like cryptocurrency and blockchain technology, which had developed largely outside traditional regulatory frameworks and had created new possibilities for financial innovation and economic organization. They argued that similar regulatory restraint was needed for artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and other emerging fields to ensure that beneficial innovations could emerge and flourish. But critics argued that this regulatory minimalism ignored the potential negative consequences of uncontrolled technological development. They pointed to examples like social media platforms, which had been allowed to develop with minimal oversight and had subsequently contributed to problems like misinformation, political polarization, and mental health issues among young people. The E/ACC movement also faced internal tensions between its accelerationist philosophical commitments and its practical political goals. While accelerationist theory suggested that technological development was largely autonomous, E/ACC advocacy implied that human choices about regulation and investment could significantly influence the pace and direction of technological progress. This tension reflected broader philosophical questions about determinism and agency that had long plagued accelerationist thought. If technological development was truly autonomous, then human advocacy for or against particular policies should be largely irrelevant to outcomes. But if human choices mattered, then technology was not truly autonomous, and traditional approaches to governance and regulation might be more relevant than accelerationists claimed. Despite these philosophical tensions, E/ACC succeeded in bringing accelerationist ideas into mainstream technology discourse in ways that previous accelerationist movements had not achieved. Major technology companies began incorporating E/AT influenced thinking into their strategic planning. Venture capital firms started using accelerationist frameworks to evaluate investment opportunities. Policymakers began grappling with accelerationist arguments about the costs and benefits of technology regulation. The movement also succeeded in creating a broader cultural narrative about technological progress that resonated beyond the technology industry itself. E/ACC advocates argued that humanity was living through the most important period in its history, facing choices about artificial intelligence and other technologies that would determine the trajectory of civilization for centuries to come. This narrative of historical significance and technological destiny appealed to people who wanted to see their work as contributing to something larger than immediate commercial or personal goals. It provided meaning and purpose for technologists who might otherwise view their careers in purely instrumental terms. But the E/ACC movement also revealed some of the dangers of accelerationist thinking when applied to real-world technological development. The emphasis on speed and competition could lead to shortcuts in safety testing, inadequate consideration of social impacts, and insufficient attention to distributional consequences of technological change. The movement's tendency to frame technological development in cosmic or evolutionary terms could also obscure the very human choices and power relationships that shaped how technologies were developed and deployed. By treating technological progress as inevitable and autonomous, E/AC thinking could become a form of ideology that justified existing power structures and discouraged critical examination of whose interests were being served by particular technological developments. These concerns became particularly acute as E/ACA IDs began influencing actual policy decisions and corporate strategies. The philosophy that had originated as a radical critique of conventional thinking about technological progress was becoming part of the conventional wisdom within important segments of the technology industry. This mainstreaming of accelerationist ideas represented both the success and the potential danger of the movement. On one hand, it demonstrated that accelerationist insights about technological dynamics and innovation processes had genuine explanatory power that could inform practical decision-making. On the other hand, it raised questions about whether accelerationist ideas were being simplified or distorted, as they moved from academic theory to business strategy. The transformation of accelerationism from a marginal philosophical movement to an influential technology industry ideology was part of a broader pattern in which ideas developed in academic or intellectual contexts were being rapidly absorbed and applied by powerful economic and political actors. This pattern reflected the increasing importance of intellectual frameworks and narratives in shaping technological development and policy decisions. But it also highlighted the challenge of maintaining critical distance and theoretical sophistication when ideas moved from contexts of scholarly reflection to contexts of commercial and political action. The accelerationist insights that had emerged from careful philosophical analysis of technological and social dynamics could be reduced to simple slogans about the benefits of speed and competition when applied to practical decision-making. The rise of E/ACC also demonstrated how accelerationist ideas could be adapted to serve different political and economic interests. While original accelerationist thinkers like Nick Land had been critical of existing power structures and had envisioned radical transformations of social organization, E/ACC could be interpreted as providing justification for existing Silicon Valley business models and libertarian political preferences. This adaptability was both a strength and a weakness of accelerationist thinking. On one hand, it demonstrated the intellectual flexibility and practical relevance of accelerationist insights. On the other hand, it raised questions about whether accelerationism had any stable political or ethical commitments, or whether it was simply a sophisticated form of technological determinism that could be used to justify any outcome that emerged from competitive technological development. As accelerationist ideas spread from academic theory to business practice to policy debate, they began to encounter the practical challenges and real-world constraints that had been largely absent from their original theoretical formulations. These encounters would test the explanatory power and practical value of accelerationist thinking in ways that purely theoretical analysis could not. The implementation of accelerationist ideas in real-world contexts revealed both their insights and their limitations, providing new data about the relationship between technological development and social change that would influence the next phase of accelerationist thinking. But it also raised urgent questions about the consequences of treating accelerationist theory as a guide for practical action, rather than simply as a tool for understanding technological dynamics. The practical implementation of accelerationist ideas across various domains of human activity has produced a complex mix of remarkable innovations and troubling consequences that illuminate both the power and the dangers of this philosophical approach. As accelerationist thinking moved from theoretical speculation to practical application, it encountered the messy realities of human institutions, social relationships, and environmental constraints that had been largely abstracted away in its original formulations. In the business world, accelerationist themes profoundly influenced corporate strategy and management philosophy throughout the 2010s and 2020s. The concept of digital transformation became ubiquitous in boardrooms around the world, typically accompanied by rhetoric about the need to move fast, embrace disruption, and accelerate innovation that directly echoed accelerationist language and concepts. Technology companies were particularly explicit in their adoption of accelerationist principles. Facebook's original motto, "Move fast and break things," became emblematic of Silicon Valley's approach to product development, prioritizing rapid experimentation and deployment over careful testing and gradual implementation. Google's pursuit of ambitious moonshot projects through its X division reflected a similar commitment to pursuing radical technological possibilities regardless of conventional constraints or immediate commercial viability. Amazon's approach to business expansion demonstrated accelerationist principles on a massive scale, using technological capabilities to rapidly enter new markets and transform entire industries, from retail to cloud computing to logistics. The company's willingness to operate at losses for years while building market position and technological capabilities reflected an accelerationist faith in the long-term benefits of rapid growth and market disruption. These corporate applications of accelerationist thinking produced remarkable innovations that transformed daily life for billions of people. Search engines made vast amounts of information instantly accessible. Social networks connected people across geographical and cultural boundaries. E-commerce platforms created new possibilities for small businesses to reach global markets. Cloud computing democratized access to powerful computational resources that had previously been available only to large organizations. But the rapid deployment of these technologies also created significant problems that had been largely unforeseen by their developers. Social media platforms contributed to political polarization, the spread of misinformation, and mental health problems among users, particularly young people. E-commerce algorithms and recommendation systems created filter bubbles that reinforced existing preferences and beliefs, rather than exposing users to diverse perspectives. The surveillance capabilities built into digital platforms enabled new forms of corporate and government monitoring that threatened privacy and autonomy. The cryptocurrency and blockchain sector became perhaps the most explicitly accelerationist domain of business activity, with advocates regularly using accelerationist rhetoric about accelerating adoption, building unstoppable systems, and creating technologies that would inevitably replace traditional financial institutions regardless of government resistance. The decentralized finance movement embraced accelerationist goals of eliminating traditional intermediaries and enabling direct peer-to-peer economic relationships. DeFi advocates argued that blockchain technology could automate many financial services through smart contracts, reducing costs and increasing accessibility while eliminating the need for banks, insurance companies, and other traditional financial institutions. But the cryptocurrency sector also demonstrated some of the risks associated with accelerationist approaches to innovation. The rapid pace of development often outstripped risk management practices and regulatory frameworks, leading to spectacular failures like the collapse of FTX, Terra Luna, and other major cryptocurrency projects that caused enormous losses for investors and undermined confidence in the entire sector. These failures revealed how accelerationist emphasis on speed and competition could lead to inadequate attention to basic security practices, financial transparency, and consumer protection. The belief that traditional regulatory constraints were unnecessary obstacles to innovation sometimes resulted in the recreation of old forms of fraud and manipulation in new technological contexts. In the realm of artificial intelligence development, accelerationist principles shape both research priorities and deployment strategies in ways that had profound implications for the trajectory of AI capabilities and their social impact. The major AI research laboratories pursued aggressive scaling strategies, continuously increasing the size and computational requirements of their models in pursuit of more capable systems. This scaling approach reflected accelerationist insights about exponential technological improvement and the benefits of pushing systems beyond their apparent limitations. Each generation of AI models demonstrated capabilities that had been thought impossible just years earlier, from beating human champions at complex games to generating human-quality text and images to passing professional examinations in law and medicine. But the rapid improvement in AI capabilities also outpaced the development of methods for ensuring these systems behaved safely and reliably. The emphasis on achieving impressive demonstrations and competitive advantages sometimes took precedence over careful testing and alignment research, creating risks that even the developers themselves acknowledged, but felt pressured to accept due to competitive dynamics. The AI industry's embrace of accelerationist principles also influenced how AI systems were deployed and integrated into existing social and economic systems. Rather than gradual introduction and careful monitoring of impacts, AI technologies were often deployed rapidly and at scale, with adjustments and safeguards developed retroactively in response to observed problems. This approach enabled rapid diffusion of beneficial AI applications in areas like medical diagnosis, scientific research, and educational assistance. But it also created disruptions in employment, amplified existing biases in decision-making systems, and enabled new forms of surveillance and control that raised significant ethical and political concerns. The environmental implications of accelerationist approaches to technological development became increasingly apparent as the energy and resource requirements of digital technologies grew exponentially. The computational demands of training large AI models required enormous amounts of electricity, often generated from fossil fuels. Cryptocurrency mining consumed energy equivalent to entire countries while producing no tangible goods or services. Data centers, which enabled the cloud computing services that powered much of the digital economy, became major consumers of both energy and water resources. The manufacturing of smartphones, computers, and other digital devices required rare earth minerals and created toxic waste streams that disproportionately affected developing countries. These environmental costs challenged accelerationist assumptions about the unambiguously positive nature of technological progress. While digital technologies enabled some environmental benefits, such as reduced travel through video conferencing and more efficient resource allocation through optimization algorithms, their overall environmental footprint was substantial and growing rapidly. The accelerationist response to environmental concerns typically involved arguments for technological solutions rather than reduced consumption or slower development. Advocates argued that continued technological acceleration would eventually produce breakthrough innovations in clean energy, carbon capture, and resource efficiency that would solve environmental problems more effectively than attempts to constrain technological development. But critics argued that this technological optimism ignored the basic physical constraints imposed by thermodynamics and planetary boundaries. They pointed out that efficiency improvements in digital technologies were being overwhelmed by increases in scale and usage, a pattern known as Jevons paradox that suggested technological solutions alone might be insufficient to address environmental challenges. In the domain of biotechnology and genetic engineering, accelerationist principles influenced research priorities and regulatory approaches in ways that promised tremendous benefits, but also raised profound ethical questions about human enhancement and the modification of natural systems. The development of CRISPR gene editing technology enabled precise modifications to DNA that could potentially eliminate genetic diseases, enhance human capabilities, and create new forms of agricultural crops and livestock. The rapid improvement in these technologies reflected accelerationist dynamics of competitive innovation and exponential capability growth. Biotech companies and research institutions pursued aggressive development timelines for gene therapies, personalized medicine, and other applications of genetic engineering. The potential to address previously incurable diseases and dramatically extend human lifespan created powerful incentives for rapid development and deployment. But the power to modify human genetics also raised questions about enhancement versus therapy, social equality, and the future of human nature itself. If genetic modifications could improve intelligence, physical capabilities, or emotional regulation, who would have access to these enhancements? What would happen to social cohesion if some humans became genetically superior to others? What did it mean to be human if human nature itself became subject to technological modification? These questions became particularly acute in the context of accelerationist thinking, which suggested that technological development would continue regardless of social preferences or ethical constraints. If genetic enhancement technologies were developed and deployed according to market dynamics and competitive pressures, the result might be a post-human future that reflected the preferences of those with the resources to access enhancement rather than broader social values about human equality and dignity. The life extension and anti-aging research community embraced explicitly accelerationist goals of using technology to transcend biological limitations and potentially achieve indefinite lifespan extension. Organizations like the SENS Research Foundation and companies like Calico pursued ambitious research programs aimed at treating aging as a medical condition that could be prevented or reversed through technological intervention. These efforts reflected accelerationist themes about transcending natural constraints and using technology to reshape fundamental aspects of human existence. Advocates argued that aging was responsible for enormous human suffering and that developing effective anti-aging therapies should be a top priority for technological development. But critics raised concerns about the social and economic implications of dramatically extended lifespans, particularly in the context of existing inequalities in healthcare access and life outcomes. If life extension technologies were expensive and available primarily to wealthy individuals, they could create new forms of inequality that persisted across multiple centuries rather than single lifetimes. The prospect of indefinite lifespan extension also raised philosophical questions about the meaning of human life, the value of mortality, and the structure of social institutions. Many aspects of human culture and social organization were based on assumptions about finite lifespans that might become obsolete if aging could be prevented or reversed. In the field of space exploration and development, accelerationist thinking influenced both government space agencies and private companies pursuing ambitious goals of human expansion beyond Earth. Companies like SpaceX embraced explicitly accelerationist rhetoric about becoming a multi-planetary species and making life multi-planetary as quickly as possible. Elon Musk's approach to rocket development at SpaceX demonstrated accelerationist principles through rapid iteration, acceptance of failure as part of the learning process, and willingness to pursue technically ambitious goals despite high risks and uncertain timelines. The company's success in developing reusable rockets and reducing launch costs reflected the potential benefits of accelerationist approaches to engineering and innovation. But space development also raised questions about whether technological acceleration was addressing the most pressing human needs or diverting resources from problems on Earth. Critics argued that the enormous investments required for Mars colonization and other space projects might be better used to address poverty, climate change, and other immediate challenges facing human civilization. The accelerationist vision of space expansion also reflected assumptions about continued exponential growth in resource consumption and technological capabilities that might not be sustainable even on a cosmic scale. While space offered enormous resources in principle, actually accessing those resources would require technological capabilities that might take centuries or millennia to develop. In the realm of education and human development, accelerationist ideas influenced approaches to learning, skill development, and human capital formation that promised to enhance human capabilities, but also raised concerns about instrumentalization and commodification of human potential. The rise of online education platforms, coding boot camps, and other forms of accelerated learning reflected accelerationist beliefs about the possibility of dramatically increasing the speed and efficiency of knowledge acquisition. These platforms promised to provide high-quality education at scale, democratizing access to skills and knowledge that had previously been available only through expensive and time-consuming traditional educational institutions. Massive open online courses enabled millions of people to access lectures and educational content from leading universities and experts around the world. Adaptive learning systems used artificial intelligence to personalize instruction and optimize learning outcomes for individual students. Microlearning platforms broke complex subjects into bite-sized modules that could be consumed efficiently during short periods of available time. But critics argued that these accelerated approaches to education often reduced learning to the acquisition of immediately useful skills rather than fostering critical thinking, cultural literacy, and the kind of deep understanding that required sustained engagement with complex ideas over extended periods. The emphasis on efficiency and measurable outcomes could also undermine the social and emotional dimensions of education that required human relationships and community engagement. Learning was not just about acquiring information, but about developing wisdom, empathy, and the capacity for ethical reasoning that might be difficult to accelerate through technological means. The healthcare sector demonstrated both the promise and the limitations of accelerationist approaches to addressing human suffering and enhancing human capabilities. The rapid development of mRNA vaccines during the COVID-19 pandemic showed how accelerated research and development could save millions of lives when facing urgent threats. The success of the vaccine development effort reflected many accelerationist principles: willingness to take risks, parallel processing of normally sequential development steps, massive resource allocation, and international collaboration focused on speed rather than conventional bureaucratic procedures. But the pandemic also revealed how accelerationist approaches could create new problems even while solving immediate ones. The rapid deployment of new technologies outpaced the ability of institutions to communicate effectively about benefits and risks, contributing to vaccine hesitancy and public confusion about evolving health recommendations. The emphasis on technological solutions also sometimes overshadowed the importance of basic public health measures, social support systems, and addressing underlying inequalities that made some populations more vulnerable to disease. The most technologically advanced countries often had worse health outcomes than countries with less sophisticated medical technologies but better social cohesion and public health infrastructure. In the domain of financial technology and economic organization, accelerationist ideas influenced the development of algorithmic trading, high-frequency trading, and other forms of automated financial decision-making that promised greater efficiency but also created new forms of systemic risk. The financialization of everyday life through apps, platforms, and services that turned previously non-market activities into sources of data and revenue reflected accelerationist logic about the expansion of market mechanisms into all areas of human experience. But the acceleration of financial markets also contributed to increased volatility, flash crashes, and other forms of instability that could cause enormous damage in very short periods of time. The complexity and speed of automated trading systems made them difficult to understand or control, even for the institutions that deployed them. The gig economy represented another application of accelerationist principles to economic organization, using digital platforms to enable rapid matching between service providers and consumers, while eliminating traditional employment relationships and institutional protections. And, sure enough, a useful technology. Companies like Uber, TaskRabbit, and DoorDash promised to increase economic efficiency by reducing transaction costs and enabling more flexible work arrangements. They used smartphone apps and algorithmic matching to create markets for services that had previously been difficult to access or coordinate. But the gig economy also demonstrated how accelerationist approaches could shift risks and costs from organizations to individuals while undermining labor protections and social safety nets that had been developed over decades of political struggle. Workers in the gig economy often lacked health insurance, unemployment benefits, retirement savings, and other forms of economic security that traditional employment provided. The platforms that connected workers with customers captured much of the economic value created, while avoiding many of the responsibilities that traditional employers bore for worker welfare. The social and psychological implications of living in an accelerating world became increasingly apparent as accelerationist ideas moved from theory into practice. The constant pressure to adapt to new technologies, changing job requirements, and evolving social norms created widespread anxiety, stress, and burnout among individuals trying to keep pace with technological change. Social media platforms accelerated cultural and political change in ways that often outpaced people's ability to process and integrate new information and perspectives. The rapid spread of trends, movements, and controversies through digital networks created a constant sense of urgency and crisis that made thoughtful deliberation and reflection more difficult. And the attention economy that underlied many digital platforms created incentives for increasingly extreme and provocative content, as creators competed for scarce user attention in an environment of information overload. This contributed to political polarization, conspiracy thinking, and other forms of cognitive distortion that undermine democratic discourse and social cohesion. Mental health professionals began documenting new forms of psychological distress related to technological acceleration, including technostress, social media addiction, and what some researchers called acceleration syndrome. The human mind, which had evolved in environments where change occurred gradually over generations, seemed poorly adapted to the rapid transformations that characterized contemporary life. But accelerationist responses to these psychological challenges typically involve technological solutions rather than slower change. Meditation apps promise to help users manage stress more efficiently. Productivity software offered to optimize time management and cognitive performance. Brain training programs claim to enhance mental capabilities to better handle information overload. The assumption underlying these technological approaches was that human psychology could be enhanced to match the pace of technological change, rather than moderating that pace to match human psychological capabilities. This reflected deeper accelerationist beliefs about the plasticity of human nature and the desirability of transcending biological limitations through technological intervention. The political implications of accelerationist thinking became increasingly apparent as these ideas influenced policy debates, electoral politics, and governance institutions. The traditional democratic processes of deliberation, compromise, and incremental change seemed inadequate to address challenges that were developing faster than political institutions could respond. Climate change represented perhaps the most acute example of this temporal mismatch between democratic processes and accelerating challenges. The scientific consensus about the need for rapid decarbonization conflicted with the political reality that democratic institutions moved slowly and were often captured by interests that benefited from existing energy systems. Some climate activists embraced accelerationist arguments for geoengineering and other technological interventions that could potentially address climate change faster than political and economic transitions to renewable energy. Others argued for accelerated deployment of existing clean technologies through streamlined regulations and massive public investment. But critics warned that accelerationist approaches to climate policy could undermine democratic governance and public participation in decisions about planetary-scale interventions. The complexity and urgency of technological solutions might require technocratic decision-making that excluded ordinary citizens from choices that would affect their lives and environments. The rise of populist political movements around the world could be understood partly as a reaction against the social disruption associated with technological and economic acceleration. These movements often promised to slow down or reverse changes that had undermined traditional ways of life, offering a form of deceleration politics that explicitly rejected accelerationist assumptions about the inevitability and desirability of rapid change. But populist movements also demonstrated how accelerationist tools and techniques could be used to pursue anti-accelerationist goals. Social media platforms enabled rapid political mobilization and the spread of anti-establishment messages. Data analytics and algorithmic targeting allowed populist candidates to reach supporters more effectively than traditional political organizations. This created paradoxical situations where anti-accelerationist political movements relied on accelerated communication technologies to achieve their goals, highlighting the difficulty of opting out of technological acceleration, even for those who opposed its social and cultural consequences. The international implications of accelerationist thinking became increasingly important as technological development became a key dimension of geopolitical competition. Countries that fell behind in artificial intelligence, quantum computing, biotechnology, and other emerging technologies risked becoming economically and militarily disadvantaged, creating powerful incentives for continued acceleration regardless of social or environmental costs. The United States and China became locked in what observers described as a new technological Cold War, with both countries investing heavily in emerging technologies and competing for technological leadership. This competition created pressures for rapid development and deployment that sometimes conflicted with safety considerations and international cooperation. The development of autonomous weapon systems, surveillance technologies, and other dual-use technologies reflected the tendency of international competition to accelerate potentially dangerous innovations beyond what might be optimal from a global perspective. Countries feared that unilateral restraint would only advantage competitors while failing to prevent harmful applications. International efforts to govern emerging technologies lagged behind the pace of technological development, creating regulatory gaps that enabled harmful applications and made coordination more difficult. The challenge of creating effective global governance for artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and other powerful technologies remained largely unsolved, despite growing recognition of its importance. The philosophical implications of living through accelerated technological change forced a broader reckoning with fundamental questions about human nature, consciousness, and the meaning of existence that had been largely stable throughout most of human history. The development of artificial intelligence systems that could perform tasks previously thought to require human intelligence challenged assumptions about human uniqueness and specialness. If machines could write poetry, create art, and engage in philosophical reasoning, what made human consciousness distinctive or valuable? The possibility of genetic enhancement and life extension raised questions about the continuity of personal identity and the nature of human flourishing. If people could modify their own cognitive and physical capabilities or extend their lifespans indefinitely, would they remain the same persons over time? What would constitute a good life if biological constraints on human potential could be transcended? The prospect of uploading human consciousness to digital systems, or merging human and artificial intelligence, raised even more radical questions about the nature of consciousness itself. Would a digital copy of a human mind be the same person or a different entity? Could consciousness exist independently of biological substrates? These questions were not merely abstract philosophical puzzles, but practical issues that societies might need to address within decades as accelerationist technologies continue to develop. The legal, ethical, and social frameworks that governed human relationships and institutions were based on assumptions about human nature that technological acceleration was calling into question. Religious and spiritual traditions faced particular challenges in adapting to accelerationist realities. Most religious worldviews had developed in contexts where human nature and social organization remained relatively stable across generations, making it difficult to address situations where fundamental aspects of human existence might be technologically malleable. Some religious thinkers embraced accelerationist ideas as consistent with spiritual themes about transcendence and transformation, arguing that technological development might represent a form of participation in divine creativity or progress towards spiritual perfection. Others criticized accelerationist thinking as representing hubris or idolatry that sought to replace divine authority with human technological power. The emergence of new forms of technologically generated spirituality reflected attempts to integrate accelerationist realities with spiritual meaning and purpose. These movements often drew on concepts from Eastern religions, New Age philosophy, and science fiction to develop worldviews that could accommodate both technological transcendence and spiritual significance. But the rapid pace of technological change also created spiritual challenges for individuals trying to find meaning and purpose in an accelerating world. Traditional sources of meaning like community membership, cultural continuity, and connection to place could be disrupted by technological change, leaving people feeling disconnected and disoriented. The psychological experience of accelerated change often involved a sense of temporal displacement, where the pace of change made it difficult to maintain coherent narratives about personal identity and life purpose. People found themselves constantly adapting to new technologies and social norms without sufficient time to integrate these changes into stable self-understanding. This temporal displacement could contribute to anxiety, depression, and existential confusion as people struggle to maintain psychological coherence in rapidly changing environments. The traditional human capacity for meaning-making seemed to require a certain amount of stability and continuity that accelerated technological change could undermine. Mental health professionals began developing new therapeutic approaches designed to help people cope with the psychological challenges of living in an accelerating world. These approaches often emphasized acceptance of uncertainty, flexibility in identity formation, and the development of coping skills for managing rapid change. But the mental health field also faced its own acceleration as new technologies like virtual reality therapy, AI-assisted diagnosis, and digital mental health platforms promised to revolutionize treatment while raising questions about the human elements of healing and therapeutic relationship. The educational implications of accelerationist thinking became increasingly complex as traditional approaches to knowledge transmission and skill development struggled to keep pace with the rate of technological change. Many of the specific skills and knowledge bases that educational institutions taught became obsolete within years of being learned, raising questions about what education should focus on in an accelerating world. Some educators embraced accelerationist approaches that emphasized learning how to learn, adaptability, and comfort with rapid change, rather than mastery of specific content areas. They argued that educational institutions needed to prepare students for careers and lives that would involve constant retraining and adaptation to new technologies and economic conditions. But critics argued that this instrumentalist approach to education could undermine the humanistic goals of learning, such as critical thinking, cultural literacy, ethical reasoning, and the development of wisdom and judgment. These capabilities might require sustained engagement with complex ideas over extended periods in ways that could not be easily accelerated. The tension between efficiency and depth in education reflected broader questions about what human capabilities were most important to preserve and develop in an age of artificial intelligence and automation. If machines could perform many cognitive tasks more efficiently than humans, what distinctively human capabilities deserved educational attention and development? The globalization of education through online platforms and digital technologies created new possibilities for democratizing access to high-quality learning resources. But it also raised concerns about cultural homogenization and the loss of local knowledge traditions that might take generations to reconstruct if abandoned. The economic implications of accelerationist thinking extended far beyond specific technology sectors to fundamental questions about work, value creation, and resource distribution. In an age of increasing automation and artificial intelligence, the prospect of widespread technological unemployment challenged basic assumptions about the relationship between economic contribution and social worth that had underpinned capitalist societies. If machines could perform most forms of human labor more efficiently than humans, what would be the basis for economic distribution and social organization? Accelerationist responses to these challenges typically involved proposals for universal basic income, reduced working hours, and new forms of economic organization that could distribute the benefits of automation more broadly. These proposals reflected optimistic assumptions about the potential for technological abundance to enable post-scarcity economic conditions. But critics argue that these proposals underestimated the political and social challenges of implementing such radical economic changes. Existing power structures and cultural values were built around work-based identity and merit-based distribution that might be difficult to change even if technological conditions made them obsolete. The concentration of ownership and control over advanced technologies in the hands of a small number of corporations and individuals also raised questions about whether the benefits of acceleration would be broadly shared or would primarily advantage those who already possessed significant resources and power. The financialization of technological development through venture capital, stock markets, and other investment mechanisms created incentives for rapid scaling and market capture, that might conflict with broader social goals of sustainable development and equitable benefit distribution. The emergence of platform capitalism, where large technology companies created digital marketplaces that captured value from interactions between users, represented a new form of economic organization that challenged traditional concepts of labor, ownership, and economic contribution. These platforms often achieved enormous valuations based on their ability to intermediate between other economic actors, rather than producing tangible goods or services themselves. This raised questions about whether such value capture represented genuine economic contribution, or a form of rent-seeking that redistributed wealth without creating new value. The environmental implications of accelerationist thinking became increasingly urgent as the scale and speed of technological development began to approach planetary boundaries in areas like energy consumption, resource extraction, and waste production. The enormous energy requirements of digital technologies, particularly cryptocurrency mining and artificial intelligence training, challenged assumptions about the environmental sustainability of continued technological acceleration. Data centers alone consumed significant percentages of global electricity production, and their energy requirements were growing exponentially. The material requirements for producing smartphones, computers, electric vehicles, and other technologies required mining operations that often caused significant environmental damage and relied on exploitative labor conditions in developing countries. The rapid replacement cycles encouraged by technological acceleration exacerbated these problems by increasing the rate of resource extraction and waste production. Accelerationist responses to environmental challenges typically emphasize technological solutions like renewable energy, carbon capture, and efficiency improvements rather than reduced consumption or slower development. The assumption was that continued technological acceleration would eventually produce breakthrough innovations that could solve environmental problems more effectively than attempts to constrain development. Some accelerationists embraced even more radical technological interventions, like geoengineering that would deliberately modify Earth's climate system to counteract the effects of greenhouse gas emissions. These proposals reflected accelerationist logic about using technology to transcend natural constraints, rather than adapting human behavior to environmental limits. But critics argued that such technological optimism ignored the complexity and interconnectedness of environmental systems that made large-scale technological interventions potentially dangerous and unpredictable. They pointed to the history of unintended consequences from previous technological interventions in natural systems as evidence for more cautious approaches. The precautionary principle, which suggested that societies should avoid potentially harmful actions even when scientific understanding was incomplete, conflicted with accelerationist principles that emphasized speed and acceptance of risk in pursuit of potential benefits. This tension reflected deeper philosophical disagreements about how to make decisions under uncertainty and how to balance present opportunities against future risks. Climate change represented perhaps the most acute example of this tension, as the need for rapid decarbonization to avoid catastrophic warming conflicted with concerns about the environmental and social impacts of rushed deployment of new technologies like nuclear power, biofuels, and large-scale renewable energy installations. The international dimensions of environmental challenges also complicated accelerationist approaches, as unilateral acceleration by some countries could create competitive pressures that undermine environmental protection efforts by others. The lack of effective global governance mechanisms for environmental issues made coordinated responses difficult even when the need for action was widely acknowledged. The social justice implications of accelerationist thinking became increasingly apparent as the benefits and harms of technological acceleration were distributed unequally across different populations and communities. The digital divide between those with access to advanced technologies and those without became a new form of inequality that could reinforce and amplify existing patterns of social and economic disadvantage. Communities that lacked access to high-speed internet, digital literacy, or expensive devices found themselves increasingly excluded from economic opportunities and social participation. The automation of manufacturing and service jobs disproportionately affected working-class communities that had relied on these forms of employment for economic stability and social identity. While new jobs were created in technology sectors, these often required educational credentials and skills that were not easily accessible to displaced workers. The surveillance capabilities enabled by digital technologies created new possibilities for monitoring and controlling marginalized populations in ways that could reinforce existing patterns of discrimination and oppression. Algorithmic decision-making systems often reproduced or amplified human biases, leading to discriminatory outcomes in areas like criminal justice, employment, and financial services. The global nature of technology supply chains meant that the environmental and labor costs of accelerated technological development were often externalized to developing countries, while the benefits accrued primarily to wealthy nations and corporations. This pattern reflected historical patterns of colonialism and exploitation that were being reproduced through technological means. Accelerationist responses to these justice concerns typically emphasize the democratizing potential of technology and the possibility of using technological tools to address social problems more effectively. They argued that broader access to technology and technology-mediated services could reduce inequalities and expand opportunities for marginalized groups. But critics argued that these technological solutions often failed to address the underlying power structures and social relationships that created inequality in the first place. Without changes to political and economic institutions, technological acceleration might simply create new forms of inequality while leaving fundamental patterns of advantage and disadvantage unchanged. The agency and participation of affected communities in decisions about technological development also became a key justice concern. The rapid pace of technological change often outpaced democratic processes for public input and oversight, leading to situations where communities were forced to adapt to technological changes they had no voice in shaping. This democratic deficit in technology governance was particularly acute for global technologies like artificial intelligence and climate engineering that could affect entire populations while being developed and controlled by small numbers of corporations and technical experts. The cultural implications of accelerationist thinking extended to fundamental questions about human values, social relationships, and the preservation of meaningful traditions and ways of life. In the face of rapid technological change, the creative destruction associated with technological acceleration often involved the elimination of traditional occupations, social institutions, and cultural practices that had provided meaning and identity for communities across generations. While new forms of culture and social organization emerged, the pace of change could be traumatic for people whose identities were tied to disappearing ways of life. The globalization of culture through digital platforms and communication technologies created new possibilities for cross-cultural exchange and hybrid cultural forms. But it also raised concerns about the homogenization of human experience and the loss of cultural diversity that had developed over millennia of human history. Language preservation became a particular concern, as digital technologies favored modern world languages, while making it more difficult to maintain smaller linguistic communities that carried unique cultural knowledge and ways of understanding the world. The acceleration of cultural change through social media and digital communication created challenges for intergenerational knowledge transmission, as traditional forms of apprenticeship, storytelling, and community learning were disrupted by new technological modes of information sharing. Religious and spiritual communities faced particular challenges in maintaining contemplative practices and community rituals that required sustained attention and gradual development in a cultural environment that increasingly valued speed, efficiency, and immediate gratification. The commodification of cultural practices through digital platforms and algorithmic curation also raised concerns about the transformation of culture from a shared community resource into a product for individual consumption, potentially undermining the social bonds and collective meaning-making that culture had traditionally provided. Psychological adaptation to accelerated cultural change required individuals to constantly update their beliefs, values, and social practices in ways that could be exhausting and disorienting. The traditional human capacity for cultural learning had evolved for much slower rates of change that allowed time for integration and reflection. Mental health professionals began documenting increases in anxiety, depression, and identity confusion that seemed related to the difficulty of maintaining coherent self-understanding in rapidly changing cultural environments. Young people seemed particularly vulnerable to these effects as they tried to form stable identities while navigating constantly evolving social norms and technological possibilities. The intergenerational tensions created by different rates of technological adaptation also strained family and community relationships as older and younger generations developed increasingly divergent approaches to technology use, social interaction, and cultural participation. Educational institutions struggled to balance the preservation of cultural heritage with the need to prepare students for technological futures that might make traditional cultural knowledge seem irrelevant or obsolete. This created ongoing tensions about curriculum priorities and the role of humanities education in technological societies. The artistic and creative implications of accelerationist thinking became increasingly complex as artificial intelligence systems developed capabilities for generating music, visual art, literature, and other forms of creative expression that had previously been considered uniquely human. AI-generated art raised fundamental questions about the nature of creativity, authorship, and aesthetic value that challenged traditional understandings of artistic production and cultural meaning. If machines could create works that were aesthetically pleasing or emotionally moving, what distinguished human creativity from algorithmic generation? The rapid improvement in AI creative capabilities also created economic pressures on human artists, writers, musicians, and other creative professionals who found themselves competing with systems that could produce content faster and more cheaply than human creators. But the democratization of creative tools through AI also created new possibilities for artistic expression. Among people who lacked traditional artistic training or access to expensive equipment and software. This expansion of creative participation could potentially enrich cultural life, even as it challenged existing economic and institutional structures for supporting professional artists. The acceleration of cultural production through digital platforms and AI assistance also raised questions about quality, depth, and meaning in artistic work. The pressure to produce content rapidly and frequently to maintain audience attention could undermine the sustained reflection and careful craftsmanship that had traditionally characterized great works of art. The algorithmic curation of cultural content through recommendation systems also influenced what kinds of artistic work received attention and support, potentially creating feedback loops that reinforced certain aesthetic preferences while marginalizing others. The preservation of human cultural heritage in digital formats created new possibilities for access and preservation, but also raised concerns about the stability and longevity of digital storage systems that might not survive technological transitions over centuries or millennia. The question of what cultural knowledge and practices deserved preservation in an accelerating world became increasingly urgent as the pace of change made it impossible to maintain all traditional forms of human culture simultaneously with emerging technological possibilities. The spiritual and existential implications of accelerationist thinking challenged traditional sources of meaning and purpose that had sustained human communities throughout history. The rapid pace of change made it difficult to maintain stable beliefs about the nature of reality, human purpose, and ultimate values. Traditional religious and philosophical frameworks had developed over centuries or millennia and were based on assumptions about relatively stable cosmic and social orders that technological acceleration was calling into question. The possibility of human enhancement, artificial intelligence, and post-human futures created scenarios that most traditional wisdom traditions had not anticipated. New forms of spirituality emerged that attempted to integrate technological and spiritual themes, often drawing on concepts from science fiction, Eastern philosophy, and contemporary scientific theories about consciousness and reality. These movements sought to find meaning and purpose in technological acceleration itself, viewing it as a form of spiritual evolution or cosmic development. But the rapid pace of technological change also created existential anxiety among people who felt disconnected from traditional sources of meaning without finding adequate replacements in technological culture. The constant pressure to adapt and optimize could undermine the contemplative practices and community relationships that many people relied on for spiritual nourishment. The prospect of indefinite life extension through technological means forced reconsideration of fundamental assumptions about human existence, including the role of mortality in creating meaning, the nature of personal growth and wisdom, and the structure of social institutions designed around finite lifespans. The possibility of uploading consciousness to digital systems or merging human and artificial intelligence raised even more radical questions about the nature of personal identity, consciousness, and spiritual significance that existing philosophical and religious traditions were poorly equipped to address. The temporal experience of accelerated change also created challenges for traditional spiritual practices that relied on patience, acceptance, and present moment awareness, in environments where the pace of change made such practices increasingly difficult to maintain. Many people reported feeling spiritually displaced by technological acceleration, caught between traditional worldviews that no longer seemed relevant and technological futures that offered power and capability but little guidance about how to live meaningfully and ethically. The search for wisdom and ethical guidance in an accelerating world became increasingly urgent as the consequences of technological choices became more far-reaching, while the time frames for making such choices became shorter. The democratic implications of accelerationist thinking posed fundamental challenges to existing institutions and practices of democratic governance that had been designed for much slower rates of social and technological change. The rapid pace of technological development often outstripped the ability of democratic institutions to understand, evaluate, and regulate new technologies before they were widely deployed and became difficult to control or modify. Legislative processes that could take years to complete were inadequate for governing technologies that could transform entire industries or social practices within months. Regulatory agencies struggled to develop expertise and oversight capabilities for rapidly evolving technologies while maintaining democratic accountability and public participation. The complexity of emerging technologies also created challenges for democratic decision-making, as ordinary citizens often lacked the technical knowledge needed to make informed judgments about complex technological issues, while experts disagreed among themselves about likely outcomes and appropriate policies. The global nature of many technological systems made national democratic control increasingly difficult, as decisions made by multinational corporations or foreign governments could have significant impacts on domestic populations without being subject to democratic oversight. The concentration of technological power in the hands of a small number of large corporations created new forms of private authority that could shape social and economic conditions without democratic accountability, leading to calls for new approaches to corporate governance and technological oversight. Some observers argued that democratic institutions themselves might need to be accelerated or technologically enhanced to keep pace with technological change, potentially through the use of artificial intelligence, prediction markets, or other technological tools for aggregating public preferences and expert knowledge. But critics worried that such technological approaches to democracy could undermine the deliberative and participatory values that made democratic governance valuable in the first place, potentially creating technocratic systems that served efficiency over representation and accountability. The temporal mismatch between democratic processes and technological change also raised questions about intergenerational justice, as current democratic decisions about technology development would have consequences extending far into the future, while future generations had no voice in current democratic processes. The challenge of representing future interests in current democratic institutions became particularly acute for technologies like artificial intelligence and climate engineering that could have irreversible consequences for human civilization and the planet as a whole. International cooperation on technology governance became increasingly important as the global nature of technological systems made unilateral national policies inadequate. But existing international institutions were often slow and consensus-driven in ways that made them poorly suited for addressing rapidly evolving technological challenges. The tension between democratic values and technological acceleration reflected deeper philosophical questions about the relationship between collective self-determination and technical efficiency that had implications extending far beyond specific policy debates. The economic transformation driven by accelerationist thinking challenged fundamental assumptions about work, value creation, and resource distribution that had underpinned industrial societies for centuries. The automation of cognitive as well as physical labor through artificial intelligence and robotics threatened to eliminate many forms of human work that had previously seemed secure from technological replacement, creating potential for widespread technological unemployment that could undermine existing economic and social structures. The concentration of ownership and control over advanced technologies in the hands of a small number of corporations and individuals raised questions about whether the benefits of technological acceleration would be broadly shared or would primarily advantage those who already possessed significant resources and technological capabilities. The financialization of technological development through venture capital, stock markets, and other investment mechanisms created incentives for rapid scaling and market capture that might conflict with broader social goals of sustainable development, worker welfare, and equitable benefit distribution. Platform capitalism, where large technology companies created digital marketplaces that captured value from interactions between other economic actors, represented a new form of economic organization that challenged traditional concepts of labor, productivity, and economic contribution. The gig economy enabled new forms of flexible work, but often shifted risks and costs from organizations to individual workers, while eliminating traditional employment protections and benefits that had been won through decades of labor organizing. The attention economy that underlied many digital platforms created new forms of value extraction based on capturing and monetizing human attention and personal data, raising questions about privacy, autonomy, and the commodification of human experience. Cryptocurrency and blockchain technologies promise to create new forms of decentralized economic organization that could operate beyond traditional state and corporate control, but also created new possibilities for speculation, manipulation, and economic instability. The energy and resource requirements of digital technologies created environmental costs that were often externalized to communities and regions that received few benefits from technological development, reproducing historical patterns of colonial exploitation through technological means. The global nature of technology supply chains meant that the social and environmental costs of accelerated technological development were often borne by workers and communities in developing countries, while the benefits accrued primarily to consumers and investors in wealthy nations. Universal basic income and other proposals for redistributing the benefits of automation faced political and practical challenges related to funding, work incentives, and social acceptance that had not been fully resolved despite growing technological unemployment. And the measurement of economic value and progress through metrics like GDP growth became increasingly problematic as technological advancement created forms of value and capability that were not captured by traditional economic indicators. The transition to post-work societies envisioned by some accelerationists would require fundamental changes to social institutions, cultural values, and individual identity formation that might take generations to accomplish, even if technological capabilities made such transitions technically feasible. The institutional implications of accelerationist thinking extended beyond specific sectors to fundamental questions about how human societies should organize themselves to govern technological development and manage its consequences. Traditional institutions like universities, government agencies, and professional organizations had been designed for much slower rates of change and struggled to adapt to the pace of technological transformation while maintaining their core functions and values. The expertise and knowledge required to understand and govern emerging technologies was often concentrated in private companies and research organizations that had little accountability to broader public interests, creating challenges for democratic oversight and public participation in technological decision-making. Professional licensing, educational credentialing, and other institutional mechanisms for ensuring competence and quality were often bypassed by technological innovations that enabled new forms of service delivery without traditional professional intermediation. Legal and regulatory frameworks struggled to keep pace with technological change, creating periods of regulatory uncertainty that could either enable harmful applications or discourage beneficial innovation, depending on how institutions responded to technological ambiguity. International institutions faced particular challenges in addressing technological issues that crossed national boundaries but required coordinated responses, as existing frameworks for international cooperation had been designed for different types of challenges and operated at much slower speeds than technological development. The scientific research enterprise faced pressures to accelerate the pace of discovery and publication to keep up with technological change, potentially undermining the careful peer review and replication processes that had traditionally ensured scientific quality and reliability. Educational institutions struggled to balance the preservation of traditional knowledge and cultural heritage with the need to prepare students for technological futures that might make much current knowledge obsolete while requiring new forms of capability and understanding. Healthcare systems face challenges in integrating new technologies like artificial intelligence, genetic medicine, and digital health platforms while maintaining safety, privacy, and equitable access that had been core values of medical practice. Financial institutions were disrupted by cryptocurrency, algorithmic trading, and other technological innovations that challenged traditional approaches to banking, investing, and monetary policy while creating new forms of systemic risk. The military and security implications of accelerationist technologies created pressures for rapid development and deployment that could conflict with democratic oversight, international law, and humanitarian values that had traditionally constrained military behavior. The adaptation of existing institutions to accelerated technological change often required trade-offs between efficiency and other values like fairness, transparency, and democratic participation that were not easily resolved through technical optimization. New institutional forms and governance mechanisms might be needed to address the challenges of governing technological acceleration, but developing such innovations required time and experimentation that might not be available given the pace of technological change. The cultural and social cohesion that enabled institutional effectiveness could be undermined by the same technological changes that made institutional adaptation necessary, creating potential feedback loops where technological acceleration made governance more difficult precisely when effective governance became most important. Looking toward the future, the trajectory of accelerationist thinking seems likely to be shaped by several converging developments that will test both its explanatory power and its practical value as a guide for technological development and social organization. The development of artificial general intelligence represents perhaps the most significant test case for accelerationist ideas, as it embodies many of the key themes about autonomous technological development, post-human futures, and the limits of human control that have been central to accelerationist thought. If AGI is developed successfully, it will provide evidence for accelerationist claims about the possibility of transcending human limitations through technological means. But the process of developing AGI will also test accelerationist assumptions about technological autonomy, as the choices made by researchers, companies, and governments about AI development will have enormous influence over outcomes. The response to climate change will similarly test accelerationist approaches to global challenges. As societies decide whether to pursue technological solutions like geoengineering and carbon capture, or more conservative approaches focused on reducing emissions and adapting to environmental changes. The success or failure of technological approaches to climate change will influence broader debates about the relationship between technological acceleration and environmental sustainability, with implications extending far beyond climate policy to questions about technological civilization's long-term viability. The social and political responses to technological unemployment and economic disruption will determine whether accelerationist visions of post-work societies become reality or whether technological acceleration generates social instability and political backlash that constrains further technological development. The emergence of effective governance mechanisms for powerful technologies will test whether democratic societies can maintain meaningful control over technological development, or whether such control will inevitably shift to technocratic or authoritarian institutions that can make decisions more quickly. The psychological and cultural adaptation to continued technological acceleration will determine whether human beings can develop the cognitive and emotional capabilities needed to thrive in rapidly changing environments, or whether the pace of change will exceed human adaptive capacity and create widespread social dysfunction. The international competition and cooperation around emerging technologies will shape whether technological acceleration leads to greater global integration and shared prosperity, or increased conflict and inequality between nations and regions with different technological capabilities. The development of enhancement technologies that can modify human cognitive and physical capabilities will test fundamental assumptions about human nature, identity, and equality that underlie existing social and political institutions. The long-term environmental and resource implications of continued technological acceleration will determine whether such acceleration is compatible with planetary boundaries and sustainable development, or whether it represents a temporary historical phase that must eventually transition to more stable forms of social organization. The philosophical and spiritual responses to post-human possibilities will influence whether technological acceleration is experienced as meaningful progress or existential crisis, shaping public attitudes toward continued technological development and human enhancement. As these developments unfold over the coming decades, they will provide new data about the relationship between technological development and social change that will inevitably influence the next phase of accelerationist thinking and its alternatives. The current moment represents a crucial juncture in the history of accelerationist ideas, as they transition from theoretical speculation to practical application in contexts where their consequences are becoming increasingly apparent and significant. The choices made in the next few years about artificial intelligence development, climate policy, economic organization, and technological governance will have implications extending far into the future, potentially determining whether accelerationist visions of post-human transformation become reality or whether alternative approaches to technological development prevail. Kirkby. Understanding accelerationist thinking is therefore not merely an intellectual exercise, but an essential component of democratic participation in decisions about technological development that will shape the future of human civilization. Whether one embraces accelerationist ideas or rejects them, engaging seriously with the questions they raise about technological autonomy, human agency, and the goals of civilization is crucial for anyone who wants to influence the direction of technological change rather than simply adapting to whatever outcomes emerge from current trends. The most dangerous aspect of accelerationist philosophy may not be its specific claims about technological development, but its potential to discourage critical examination of technological choices by treating them as inevitable rather than contested. The greatest risk may be that accelerationist ideas become a form of ideology that justifies existing power structures and technological trajectories while discouraging democratic deliberation about alternatives. But accelerationist thinking also offers valuable insights about the dynamics of technological development and the challenges of governing complex systems that operate at scales and speeds that exceed traditional institutional capabilities. These insights remain important even for those who reject accelerationist conclusions about the inevitability or desirability of continued technological acceleration. The future of accelerationist ideas will ultimately depend on their ability to explain and predict technological developments, while providing useful guidance for practical decision-making about technological development and social organization. As we stand at this historical inflection point, facing choices about artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, climate intervention, and other powerful technologies that could reshape civilization, the questions raised by accelerationist thinking become impossible to ignore. Whether technological development is autonomous or subject to human control, whether acceleration is beneficial or harmful, whether post-human futures are desirable or dystopian, these are not abstract philosophical questions, but practical issues that will be resolved through the collective choices of individuals, organizations, and societies over the coming years. The accelerationists have forced us to confront these choices directly and urgently. They have challenged comfortable assumptions about human agency and technological progress. They have revealed the inadequacy of existing institutions and frameworks for governing technological change. But they have also demonstrated the dangers of treating technological development as inevitable and beyond human influence. They have shown how sophisticated philosophical arguments can be used to justify questionable technological choices and political arrangements. The task now is to move beyond simple acceptance or rejection of accelerationist ideas toward more nuanced approaches that can preserve their insights while avoiding their excesses and limitations. This will require developing new forms of technological wisdom that can thoughtfully assess the promises and perils of emerging technologies, new institutions that can govern technological development democratically while operating at appropriate scales and speeds, and new cultural values that can guide technological choices in directions that serve human flourishing rather than abstract metrics of progress or efficiency. Most importantly, it will require maintaining a sense of human agency and moral responsibility, even in the face of technological forces that seem beyond individual control. While no single person can determine the direction of technological development, the collective choices of millions of individuals do shape technological trajectories in profound ways. Every time we choose which technologies to adopt, which companies to support, which policies to advocate for, and which values to prioritize in our personal and professional lives, we are participating in the collective process that determines our technological future. The accelerationists may be right that we cannot stop the acceleration of technological change, but they may be wrong to assume that we cannot influence its direction. The future remains open, and our choices still matter, even in an accelerating world. In the end, the most dangerous philosophy in history may not be accelerationism itself, but any philosophy that denies human agency and moral responsibility in the face of technological change. Whether we call ourselves accelerationists or decelerationist, optimists or pessimists, technologists or humanists, we all share the responsibility of ensuring that technological development serves human flourishing rather than undermining it. That responsibility cannot be delegated to markets, algorithms, or experts. It belongs to all of us, and it requires our active engagement with the most important questions of our time. What kind of future do we want to create? What values should guide technological development? How can we ensure that the benefits of technological progress are shared broadly rather than concentrated among a few? How can we manage the risks of powerful technologies while preserving their benefits? These are the questions that will define the next phase of human civilization. How we answer them will determine whether the acceleration of technological change leads to human flourishing or human suffering, whether it expands human possibilities or constrains them, whether it brings us closer together or drives us further apart. The accelerationists have done us the service of forcing us to confront these questions directly, and urgently. Now it is up to all of us to answer them wisely, with full awareness of both the tremendous opportunities and the grave responsibilities that come with wielding technologies that could reshape the future of consciousness and intelligence in the universe. The story of accelerationism is far from over. Indeed, its most important chapters may be just beginning, written not by philosophers and theorists alone, but by all of us as we navigate the choices that will determine whether humanity's accelerating technological capabilities become instruments of liberation or destruction, wisdom or folly, hope or despair. The future is not predetermined, despite what the accelerationists might claim. It remains to be written through the countless individual choices that, aggregated together, will determine the trajectory of technological civilization and the fate of human consciousness in an age of artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, and powers that previous generations could scarcely imagine. This is our moment of greatest responsibility and greatest opportunity. How we rise to meet it will echo through the centuries, shaping not only our own lives, but the lives of countless generations yet to come. The accelerationists have shown us the stakes. Now we must choose our path forward with wisdom, courage, and an unwavering commitment to the flourishing of consciousness and intelligence in all its forms.